In the previous lesson we have made our timeline indicator update its position every second. But there is actually a little issue with this behavior related to performance, because once we're gonna leave this timeline page, the timer, which is responsible for updating the position of the timeline indicator, will not be stopped and will be continue running. Let's just make sure that this is really the case. So I'm going to put console log statement inside the closure of the set interval function like this, and let's see what is going to happen whenever we're gonna leave timeline page. So as we can see, logs started appearing in the console, but even after we're gonna leave timeline page, these logs will be continue printing, so the timer doesn't actually stop. So now we have to figure out when we should stop the timer and when we should start it again. And since our timeline indicator component is contained within another page component called the timeline, and in our application all page components are rendered by using dynamic component in the root component in here. And just because we are wrapping this dynamic component in another special component keep alive, whenever we are switching between pages and therefore page components change, they are not actually destroyed, instead their state is cached, and whenever we move back to the previous page, the whole state of the page is restored once we come back to this page. And there is a way for us to know when the page component will be activated or deactivated. And to run a particular logic when the component will be deactivated or activated, we can use a couple of additional hooks that we have already used before. Those hooks are onActivated and onDeactivated. First of all, we have to import those from the Vue package. And now let's start using them. Let's begin with onActivated. So in the closure of this hook, we're gonna place that instruction which starts our timer, which makes indicator update its position every second. And since we're gonna have to stop this timer once we'll leave timeline page, we need to save the reference to this timer in a variable. Let's create the variable in here called timer, and then store the reference to this timer in this variable. And now we can easily stop this timer whenever we're gonna leave timeline page. We will do it inside the closure of onDeactivated hook. So in here all we have to do is actually stop the timer by calling native function clearInterval, passing the reference to our timer, like this. And now for testing purposes and to make it more obvious when these hooks are actually called, I'm going to place arbitrary console log statements in every hook in here, as well as inside the onDeactivated hook. So once we're gonna initially load timeline page, we can see that the activated hook gets called, and right after that, our timer starts, which updates indicator position. And of course, once we will go to a different page, onDeactivated hook of timeline indicator component gets called, as we can see, and our timer is stopped, because we no longer see logs of the word timer in the console. And once I'm gonna go back to the timeline page, the timeline indicator component is activated again, and our timer is started as well. But there is actually a little problem with the initial position of the timeline indicator. When we restart the timer, when we come back to the timeline page, we should actually reset the position of timeline indicator. So let's go back to the editor. And every time right before we start the timer to update indicator position, let's update the value of the reactive variable seconds since midnight. We're gonna have to assign the current amount of seconds passed since midnight up until this moment, which means we simply have to call this function, calculate seconds since midnight. And now let's see that indicator initial position will be the same when we initially load timeline page, as well as when we are coming back to timeline page from another page. So looks like the position is fixed now. So at the end, let's go back to the editor and remove all helper console log statements from this hook, onActivated as well as onDeactivated. And this way we were able to improve the performance of our application by starting and stopping the timer, which updates timeline indicator position whenever we are switching pages. The link to the repository of this project will be in the video description.